The Roman Empire did not fall. Not the way you were taught. There was no single catastrophe, no dramatic last stand, no moment when the lights went out across the ancient world. What actually happened was far stranger and far more disturbing. For 500 years, Rome was the closest thing humanity had ever produced to a permanent civilization. 60 million people lived under its laws. Roads connected Scotland to Mesopotamia. A merchant in Alexandria could send a letter to a soldier in Britain and expect it to arrive. This was the default state of the Western world. And then, slowly, it wasn't. Edward Gibbon blamed Christianity. Other scholars blamed the barbarians, the lead pipes, the moral decay. Every generation rewrites the cause to mirror its own anxieties. But the real answer requires you to let go of the idea that empires end. Sometimes they transform beyond recognition while insisting they haven't changed at all. Beat one, the military problem. By the 3rd century, Rome was no longer a conquering force. It was a defending one. The frontier stretched nearly 10,000 miles. Holding that line required an army too large to pay and too spread thin to be effective. Emperors began recruiting the very people threatening the borders, Germanic tribes, Goths, Huns, and paying them in land and Roman titles to fight for Rome. This wasn't weakness at first. It was pragmatism. These soldiers fought hard and died loyally. But something subtle began to shift. The army that defended Rome stopped being Roman in any meaningful cultural sense. By the late 4th century, commanders like Stilicho, a half-Vandal general, were the most powerful men in the empire. Rome had not been invaded. Rome had been quietly renegotiated. Beat two, the economic collapse no one talks about. The Roman economy ran on conquest. Expansion brought slaves, tribute, and looted wealth that funded everything. The roads, the grain doles, the legions. But once expansion stopped, the machine began consuming itself. Emperors debased the currency, slashing silver content in coins to pay soldiers and officials. What had been a silver denarius became, within 2 centuries, a bronze coin with a thin silver wash. Inflation followed. Trade contracted. The middle class, merchants, artisans, small landowners, was effectively wiped out by taxation so aggressive it became predatory. Some citizens voluntarily surrendered themselves to large landowners as serfs simply to escape the tax collector. The empire's own fiscal system was devouring its population from the inside. Beat three, the plagues. This part is almost never given enough weight. Between 165 and 180 AD, the Antonine Plague, likely smallpox, killed an estimated 5 million people. A century later, the plague of Cyprian struck again, killing at its peak 5,000 people per day in the city of Rome alone. These weren't isolated events. They were recurring catastrophes that broke supply chains, decimated armies, and shattered the psychological confidence of a civilization. When the plague of Cyprian arrived, the Bishop of Carthage preached that Christians should care for the sick regardless of faith. Pagans fled. Christians stayed and nursed the dying. The moral authority of the church grew precisely as the authority of the state crumbled. Rome's spiritual vacuum was being filled in real time, in the streets, around the bodies of the dead. Beat four. The empire didn't fall. It moved. In 330 AD, Emperor Constantine consecrated a new capital on the Bosphorus Strait. Constantinople was strategically brilliant, protected by water on 3 sides, positioned to control trade between Europe and Asia. The center of gravity of the Roman world shifted east, and the Eastern Empire, what we now call Byzantium, survived for another 11 centuries. When Romulus Augustulus, the last Western emperor, was deposed in 476 AD, the date most textbooks give as the fall, the Eastern emperor in Constantinople didn't even bother to appoint a successor. He simply absorbed the title. The West wasn't conquered. It was quietly abandoned by the very institution that had created it. The man who deposed Romulus Augustulus was Odoacer, a Germanic chieftain. But Odoacer didn't declare himself emperor of a new Germanic kingdom. He declared himself a servant of Constantinople. He wore Roman dress. He maintained Roman law. He minted Roman coins. Even the men who ended Rome could not imagine a world without it. Now, here is the turn. The real mystery of Rome's fall is not how it ended. It's how completely it refused to end. The Catholic Church preserved Roman administrative structures. Medieval kings legitimized themselves through invented connections to Roman lineage. The Holy Roman Empire, founded in 800 AD, claimed direct succession to Augustus. Scholars in the Renaissance did not believe they were rediscovering a lost civilization. They believed they were continuing one. Look around. The building where your country's laws are debated was almost certainly designed to look Roman. The legal principles that govern contracts, property, and citizenship in most of the Western world trace directly to Roman jurisprudence. Latin lasted as the language of science, medicine, and diplomacy until the 18th century. The Roman Empire did not fall. It dissolved into everything that came after it. What actually collapsed in 476 AD was a payroll, an administrative structure, a chain of command that had already become a fiction long before Odoacer sat down in Ravenna. The civilization itself was too deeply embedded in the DNA of Europe, its laws, its roads, its language, its God, to simply cease. And perhaps that is the most unsettling lesson history offers. Civilizations rarely end. They transform, fragment, and persist in forms their founders would barely recognize. The question worth asking is not whether Rome fell, but whether we would recognize